Well, hello and welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with Sir Lawrence Freedman. He is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and I have to say how delighted I am personally that they stuck to their guns, as it were, and kept war studies rather than anything else. He's, I think it's fair to say, the UK's leading expert in strategic studies. He's an award-winning author who clearly has been very much in demand in this past year because of all the developments and then the eventual invasion of Ukraine. And his book, as you say, as you've heard, Command, is a very wide-ranging book that really tries to unpick not just military history, but particularly the whole question of how military force is deployed, by whom, and what are the various pitfalls, particularly in the relationship between the political and the military. So that's what we'll be talking about. Now, just to give you a sense of the format, the event tonight is going to run for an hour. For the first 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be in conversation with Sir Lawrence, primarily about his book. If time allows, we'll also talk a bit more about Ukraine. Though if you do want to hear his views about Ukraine, let me very much recommend that you take a look at his Substack, for those of you who know what a Substack is, which is Comment is Freed. Anyway, after that, we will then go to your questions. You can be asking questions at any time, so do by all means do it as soon as you have a thought. There is a little Ask Questions button under the video screen. So you click on that, you type your question. If you want your name mentioned, then by all means include it, but it's fine otherwise, and then make sure you press send. So that's the nuts and bolts. I will be reminding you at some point during the course of the next hour. But Laurie, let me just start with you. And at first, I was going to frame this in a very tactless way by saying, what was the point of this book? But let me reframe that as, what is the point that you would most like to come through with this book?
Thank you. Well, the point of the book for me was a point that I've actually been bothering me for some time, which is the tendency for people when they're writing about military operations as opposed to grand strategy to forget the politics, to look at questions of tactics and how you deploy your forces in isolation. Yeah, every conflict I've looked at, and unfortunately I've had opportunities to look at many now. The politics is crucial. It infuses everything that the generals do. So I wanted to bring that out. And also, I think it challenges the idea that civilians sort of set the objectives and the military just implement them in some way. The civilians, when setting the objectives, need to know what the military is saying, what they think is possible and not possible. So that was the underlying theme. And then the other point for me was to look at post-1945 military history. There are excellent books being produced all the time on the First World War, on the Second World War, but not so much about the military history of the past 80 years. And I wanted to look more at that because there are a lot of absolutely fascinating conflicts that are known to specialist audiences, but not perhaps so well known to the general public.
Okay, now it's interesting what you say about the political dimension, because clearly we also have a problem now, or a challenge perhaps, that we have a political class which includes some people who have military experience, but on the whole not. You know, we are post an era in which people will have done their national service, for example, and therefore matters military are often things that they're going to have seen on screen. And I am led to understand that war films sometimes are not the best guide to how modern conflicts really go. So again, before I move on to my next question, I just wanted to sort of dig a little bit deeper in that. How well do you feel, and whether one can generalize, that modern political elites in the West in particular, because obviously you have different situations with dictators, which again I'll come to in a little bit, how well do you think they actually understand the constraints and the realities of the use of military force?
Well, they've been through two pretty grueling experiences with Iraq and Afghanistan, if we're looking at the UK and the US. And I think it is the case, actually. There's a generation of politicians that include quite a number now who've had that sort of experience, who've had some experience of those wars. There was a period after basically George H. Bush, who had quite a distinguished career in the Air Force during the Second World War, none of the subsequent US presidents have military experience. More to the point, they'd avoided getting military experience by avoiding Vietnam, with the exception of Obama, who was too young. So that did make a difference, and I think it created a tension in the in civil-military relations. In the UK, I mean, I was struck when looking at the Falklands. I thought Thatcher obviously was of a generation who remembered the Second World War, but she had no understanding at all of military things. But of the members of her war cabinet, 2 had got military crosses during the Second World War. Now, that obviously wouldn't be the case now. And they were very important in saying this is how war goes. The tragedies do happen in war. You can't expect things to work exactly as planned. So I think it's an understanding of the pitfalls of war that is important. And while anybody who's watched our experience of in this century knows plenty about pitfalls, it's connected with counterinsurgency by and large. Whereas, of course, what we're seeing at the moment is a completely different set of pitfalls, a sort of a conventional war of a sort we really haven't seen for a long time, and a reminder of the things that can go very badly wrong in those sorts of wars as well.
It was interesting that you mentioned the Falklands War, because I thought one of the many very sort of strong case studies in the book was precisely your exploration of the Falklands War, which of course you're fairly sort of marinated in the history thereof. And again, the interesting juxtaposition in that, on the one hand, we had Margaret Thatcher's essentially civilian cabinet, though obviously, as you say, with people with experience, actually seemed to understand the realities of what they were taking on a lot better than a military junta full of people wearing uniforms. Can you just sort of unpick why that would be? Because one would automatically assume that generals understand war.
One would. So I think on the British side, it's because there was a degree of deference to the Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terry Lewin, who did understand naval warfare. He also had seen experience during the Second World War. And basically, he was very careful to give advice to the War Cabinet to get their judgment, but actually they left a lot to him. And he used the authority carefully and won't say successfully. And he had a series of quite experienced admirals below him. On the junta side, it's sort of an interesting example of the extent to which once you get drawn into running a country as opposed to running an army, your military experience tends to count for less. What the junta had been doing had been persecuting opponents within Argentina rather than preparing to fight wars. And the factionalism and the sort of infighting that develops in the sort of constant power struggles that go on in these sorts of juntas undermined their capacity to actually fight a war. Galtieri had no serious relevant experience. Admiral Anaya, who ran the Argentine Navy, sort of did, but he was a very hardline nationalist and took fright as soon as he lost one of his big ships.
Yeah, it's interesting, this question of what happens when militaries do things that are not military. I mean, you also talk, for example, about South Korea and the degree to which actually when militaries not only start running the country, but also get concerned about coup-proofing themselves, that becomes an issue. Could you kind of elaborate on that a little?
I think the coup-proofing point is really interesting because it happens particularly with dictators who've claim to be field marshals or whatever by putting on a uniform, like Mobutu in Zaire or Saddam Hussein in Iraq, without actually having any particular relevant experience. But if they put on a uniform, they think they can give orders. But precisely because of the way they've come to power, they're nervous about people coming to power in the same way. So instead of looking for professional competence in their leaders, they look for loyalty instead. And sometimes this can be absolutely disastrous because with Mobutu, for example, it was in the end he only really trusted relations. With Saddam, it had to be members of the Ba'ath Party. And eventually, when they get into a war, it happened with Saddam in the war with Iran that went on for much of the 1980s, he was losing. And he suddenly realized he actually did need people who understood how to run armies in charge. Another example is President Thieu in South Vietnam, who didn't even want his senior generals to confer with one another, lest they start plotting when they did, because there'd been a succession of military coups, which is how he got to power. So it's an important aspect of why authoritarian regimes, not all of them, but often fail, is because they don't trust the generals to get on with fighting wars rather than plotting to take over the government.
Yes, I mean, very much thinking of the shade of Joseph Stalin, who purged his officer corps before the Second World War. But fortunately for him, in 1942, he realized that actually political hacks do not necessarily make better generals than professional soldiers. And you have this kind of grotesque spectacle of people actually like Rokossovsky being pulled out of Gulag labor camps and saying, you know, with a sort of metaphorical, whoops, here's your uniform. You are now in command of a front or whatever. But that point you make, and it's something that comes up in the book, which sounds very counterintuitive, is precisely that, in fact, democracies are better war-fighting engines than dictatorships. And it is precisely because of this issue of what checks and balances and a concern about not trusting your own soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, democracies, as we know, can make big mistakes. So it doesn't guarantee that they don't make unnecessary moves into warfare, but they have an ability to adjust and adapt thereafter. There are checks and balances, whereas I think the problem with dictators, autocrats, is that they get surrounded by sycophants. You don't have that sort of still small voice saying, are you sure this is a good idea? Have you thought about this? What happens if they do that? You don't have that. So they can be bold, they can catch their opponents by surprise, but then all the pitfalls that they might have been alert to then catch them by surprise. And they believe that it becomes hubris, and they believe their own bravado. So I think there are a number of examples of just this lack of self-awareness. And it is worth noting that though Western military experience has got Vietnam, and it's got Iraq, and it's got Afghanistan, these weren't defeats in battle. These were getting into situations where you just weren't welcome in the places where you were occupying. Where you get real defeats in battle, this is often because people assume that military power can achieve things for them that it really can't.
Now, hopefully, again, I'm sure there'll be questions on this topic, but if we have time, we'll come to Ukraine properly at the end of this conversation. But as you were speaking, I mean, apart from the fact that, if I had one little sort of wish, I had wished that, in fact, there was more about basically the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese. It'd been interesting to see that. But how far, again, in many ways, you're talking about the war in Ukraine. You are precisely talking about a leader who, on the one hand, assumes that he knows about military matters, even though Putin has, a little derisory amount of reserve officer training when he was at university, which, if you talk to any Soviet citizen of that generation, they'll tell you just how little it was involved. And yet he puts himself at the fore of sort of planning and determining how he will fight this war. And then you have President Zelensky, a man who clearly also has no real military experience, but is instead willing to adopt his role as the political leader, the rallying force, the icon, and the advocate abroad, while he lets his generals be his generals. I mean, so it's a real case study of precisely that issue about how societies shape the military. But of course, I mean, that obviously depends on the politicians being willing to accept their role. But it also presumably depends on the military learning how they're going to interact with the politicians. So they're commanders, but they're also advocates. And that obviously can become a problem. There's a very nice little vignette in your book. I mean, you talk about this clearly a lot also in the context of the French wars of, well, I was going to say colonial wars, but really they were decolonial wars.
Yeah.
But particularly Wes Clark in Kosovo. And the point when sort of he gets his sort of furious response, the Secretary of Defense asked me to give you some verbatim guidance. So here it is. Get your expletive deleted, face off the TV. No more briefings, period. Well, that's it. Is there an issue now that we have also a kind of a, not a generation, but let's say a particular cohort of military officers who precisely, they do understand the political context. They are media savvy. They know how much the camera loves to see some craggy-faced guy in camouflage, and use that precisely to try and get the politicians to do what they want.
Well, it is an issue, and it's been an issue particularly in the American system. It's happened a bit in the UK, but it's more in the American system. There's one particular example in when Obama came to power. And he was under pressure to do something about Afghanistan. And it was a difficult one for him because he'd made a name for himself by denouncing the war in Iraq, but he sort of described Afghanistan as a good war. Yet actually, when he arrived, it was clearly not going very well. And Stan McChrystal was put in charge, General Stan McChrystal was put in charge of trying to find a way forward in Afghanistan, and he came up with a plan that was going to involve tens of thousands extra troops going to Afghanistan. And they went on television, they gave interviews, they leaked stuff to the Washington Post, they spoke at conferences, all making this the obvious thing to do, so that Obama began to feel bounced into doing something he wasn't sure about. And precisely because he had no military experience himself, he didn't feel that able to fight back. So that just led to protracted and long discussions, and actually a rather unsatisfactory compromise at the end, whereby they got the troops, but only for a limited time, which meant, of course, the Taliban didn't have to work out very hard what they had to do to see this out. They just had to wait. So that was a very good example of the military getting ahead of themselves. I mean, you mentioned the French decolonial wars, the wars of national liberation for the Vietnamese and the Algerians. So in the case of Algeria, the French army felt they'd won. They'd suppressed the FLN. They'd using methods that were pretty brutal, including torture. They had beaten the enemy, and then they found that de Gaulle, who obviously was not short of military credibility himself, who they'd helped to bring to power, because when the previous government looked like reneging on the commitment to Algérie Français, they suddenly discovered he was going to do the same, and yet another coup was in the offing. So you do get this sense sometimes of those who are absolutely committed to the fight being absolutely furious with the political echelon who isn't giving it the support that they think it deserves. And if we talk about Ukraine, we can see this happening a bit in Russia at the moment. So this sort of, there's a point where you're not giving advice anymore in uniform. You're moving beyond giving advice to thinking, actually, you could do the political job better. And that's what leads to coups, or can lead to coups.
Yeah, and that creates this interesting sort of issue about the fact that, obviously, this book's called Command, which implies a very sort of rigid chain of command. But in some cases, we actually find ourselves in the position in which, people, generals or military officers, will regard insubordination actually as a virtue. And again, just one other quote. a very, very sort of telling one from Ariel Sharon, the Israeli general, who said, "When I receive an order, I treat it according to three values. The first and most important is the good of the state. The state is the supreme thing. The second value is my obligation to my subordinates. And the third value is my obligation to my superiors." Now, Ariel Sharon, whatever his military talents, was also, a thoroughgoing pain in the backside to anyone, any government that tried to give him orders. And we would regard that as something insubordination. But, there have also been times in which, in many ways, we've actually depended on that. Whether it was Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, wasn't it, in 1983, a Soviet sort of officer in a nuclear missile silo who decided that actually this didn't look like an American missile attack and chose to ignore rules, or whether it's Mike Jackson at Pristina airport when facing Russian paratroopers in Kosovo in the middle of the Balkans War, and actually telling, again, Wes Clark that he isn't going to start World War III for him. Where's the balance? How far can we actually rely on soldiers' own sense of what is the right thing to do?
I mean, there's two parts to it. I think the first is we do rely on junior officers and sometimes quite senior officers being prepared to take an initiative. Sometimes they have to. Communications have been cut. They're in a situation which nobody could have anticipated. There's no time to get better orders and so on. And that's an important quality, and we expect it, and certainly in the West. And where you lack it, it causes more problems because while people are waiting for better orders, they get overrun. So this sort of mission command and delegation of command, that's quite an important quality. Then you get the sort of inherently insubordinate, like Sharon is a perfect example. Sharon invariably had contempt for whoever was giving him orders. And it was only with great effort that he managed to be reined in. He happened to be a brilliant operational commander. He was extremely good at that. But he always wanted to go too far, or always wanted to get on with things. And of course, when he was in charge as Minister of Defense in 1982, this was catastrophic, because there was nobody holding him back, and he led Israel into this tragic war in the Lebanon. We're living with the consequences still. So people like Moshe Dayan, who was superior to Sharon, were always trying to exercise control, but saw the virtues of him if you could control him. So I think this is the politics of it vary. So there's two interesting issues with both Sharon and Jackson. One of the issues with Sharon in 1973 during the October War is actually just being called back as a reservist to lead his division, having just become a politician, having just been one of the founders of the Likud party. And he was constantly assuming that one of the other divisions under Southern Command, which was led by one of the ruling party, the Labour Party, was sort of being preferred to him and getting the share of the glory. So there was a genuine political partisan competition between the two divisions. With Jackson, the issue was the problems of multilateral operations, of coalition operations. Jackson was a UK commander in charge of a NATO force, whereas Jackson was in overall charge of the NATO operation, but he was having trouble with that quote you suggest with his own senior officers who thought he was pushing for a more aggressive policy than the administration wanted. But the fact is that Jackson could get a red card from the British government if the British government were persuaded that he was being asked to do things that went against British policy. So what it actually shows, and why the book is about the politics of military operations, is that when you have these very complex command arrangements, where there's more than one chain of command that has to be aligned, you can get clashes of this sort. And in the end, I mean, the problem was that Westcott was right in his analysis of what the Russians were up to, but Jackson was right that he could deal with it as the man on the ground, which is what he was able to do. Although I don't think it was ever close to World War III, as his little outburst suggested.
No, but it is amazing what sharing a bottle of whiskey with your Russian oppo actually can help as a means to achieving some kind of battlefield détente. I want to go into actually talking about actually how in the future command may change, but obligatory little reminder, do by all means, if you have any observations, people would like to tweet out, remember, use the hashtag IQ2. And likewise, we're getting some interesting questions coming in, but if you'd like to place your own question, just use the Ask a Question, logically enough, tab at the bottom of the screen. Anyway, yes, to the future. I mean, one of the interesting things is that when I was reading the book, I was wondering how far the changes in technology and notions of war in this quite extraordinary 80-year period, how far they would change. And obviously, some things they change a lot, particularly obviously the advent of nuclear weapons. And others on the human dimension actually are still very, very similar and familiar. So really, I just wanted to kind of look at three aspects of how war seems to have changed and is changing, and see how you felt this affects not just the nature of command, but also the usability of military force and so forth. And the first one is everything's so damn fast these days. I mean, on the one hand, you've got now commanders back in their bunkers who are watching real-time video feeds from soldiers' helmet cameras and drones and everything else, temptation to micromanage and such like. But so, you know, on the one hand, unparalleled levels of information on the battlefield. But also, on the other hand, things just are happening very, very quickly, you know, not just the speed at which things move, but you know, essentially the political environment can also change. I mean, how far is that making command in a sort of strategic top-down sense harder or even impossible, or quite the opposite? Does it make it easier when actually every sergeant can metaphorically have a colonel breathing over his shoulder?
Yes, I think it's one of the most important changes. It's different. I mean, it has pluses and minuses, and it partly depends on the sort of common sense of those in these situations. So, you know, if you go back to the first couple of decades after the Second World War, communication technology hadn't changed. Even if you go up to the Falklands, there were enormous difficulties in secure communications between parts of the fleet, so that, you know, Jeremy Moore, who was on the QE2, the land commander, traveling to the South Atlantic, the secure communications just went. So he was almost incommunicado during a critical part of the war. 10 years later, in Desert Storm, then you're starting to see the impact of communications technology affecting both the media coverage of the war and the close interaction between the national capital and the generals, and between the generals and the junior officers. But you know, under Obama, you have him sitting around with his National Security Council watching the operation to take out bin Laden. So there's enormous changes over this period. Now, one of the issues is, and you actually, again, keep on coming back to it, we saw it in the early stages of the current war, is it's fine until your communication links get broken. And that can happen, and they can get disrupted. So a lot of effort now goes into disrupting these communications link, cyber attacks or as well, or inserting fake news into all of this. So, as you have written yourself, all of this can be weaponized, and so it can confuse the information environment, as well as give you clarity. It also, as again you indicate, it can mean you can have both the strategic corporal, a very junior officer, suddenly finds themselves, because of the nature of the conflict, with big decisions to make and not really time to ask anybody else how to do it, but the tactical general who's watching there saying, interfering without necessarily appreciating all the factors at work. They can see so much, but maybe they can't see how tired the soldiers are, or the difficulties they've been having with logistics. There's all sorts of things that they may just not appreciate, even though the video feed's working well. So it's a complicating factor. I'd say the situation awareness of a modern commander is extraordinary, potentially now, and something that the sort of commanders in the world wars could have only dreamed about in terms of what they can know. But again, if you're following the current war, as you know, an awful lot of people have got situational awareness and are putting stuff out on Telegram posts and other social media, which isn't so good for operational security. So it's an incredibly complex operational environment. I think it is one of the things that's changed probably more than anything else over this period, other than nuclear weapons, which I think you're right to highlight as the big one.